Boker Tov. Today's daf is daf Tzadi Tes, and we began yesterday with the sugya of Zroa Ba'ayil. And the question is, why is it that in the case of Zroa Ba'ayil, which is min b'mino, that two categories that are of the same kind with the same taste, and yet the Torah allows you to permit the eating of the ayil to a non-Kohen? Doesn't the ayil have the taste of the zroa? And the zroa is only mutter to Kohanim, it's also to non-Kohanim. And the answer is that the Torah in this case was matir. And the reason for that is, just one second. Arnie? Wait, somebody put in my phone because it's disturbing my shia. Sorry about that. So the Gemara wants to derive the ligmar minei, that even though we have a tam of the zroa in the ayil, nevertheless we can be mavatal that tam, and we don't consider it as if it's the be'en itself, which is called a principle that we ended the shir with yesterday called tam ki'ikar. So we're going to come to the conclusion from the fact that bittul operates and is valid in the case of zroa ba'ayil, that tam lav ki'ikar. And here we have a case of kachim, which is even more chomer than chulin. So the Gemara says, Goli Rachmana Gabi Chatas. We're going to have two Yalfusos that contradict each other. From Zroa Ba'ayil, we're going to derive one conclusion, namely that Tam Lav Ki'ikar, but from Karban Chatas, we're going to have a derivation to the opposite conclusion, and then we'll have to figure out which of these two derivations should we rely on. Gemara says, so for example, if a chatos comes in contact with a shlomim, then from the moment that there's contact, the shlomim takes on the chumras of chatos, which would mean that it could only be eaten in the azara and only by zichrei kahuna. And not only that, it could be that if the chatos, we'll call it Roman numeral number 1, came in contact with something else, let's say it's a shlomim Roman numeral number 2, and the chatas Roman numeral number 1 was pasul, then that psule mukdashim would now be passed on to the shlomim. She'im psulati pasel, v'im ksherim te'ochel kechara sheba. If the chatas is a chatas hakshera, then the shlomim could only be eaten within the azara, and it could only be eaten for 1 day and 1 night, as opposed to shlomim, which are eaten for 2 days and 2 nights. And it can only be eaten by zichrei kahuna. So therefore, although we would have a kula that we would derive from zroa be'ayil in the case of nazir, and that means that tam lav ki'ikar. So tam lav ki'ikar means if we can remove the original bn of isur, and all we have left is tam, then we could be mavatal the tam. But from chatos, we come to the opposite conclusion, and that would be lechumra. So we have a kula derived from zroa ba'ayil, and we have a chumra derived from chatos. And therefore, the Gemara says, "My chazis the gamri mehach ligmehach." We're in a bind over here. We're at a parshas drachim. We don't know whether to turn this way or that way. Should we rely on Nazir and come to the conclusion lakula that tam lav ki ikar? Should we rely on chatas and come to the conclusion that tam ki ikar? So the Gemara answers, chidush hu me chidush lo gamrina. Even though we could, in theory, derive conclusions from El Nazir that Tam Lav Ki Ikar, we could be Mavatal the Tam, but nevertheless, since the Torah allowed cooking the Zroa B'Shelo Lichatchila, which is something that we never find anywhere in the halachas of taruvas. Whenever there's a mixture of isa v'het, we don't allow you to cook isa. Take a piece of nevela and throw it into a pot and say, well, it's batel. That you can't do. And yet here the Torah is telling you l'chatchila, rely on bittul. Go ahead and cook the zroa in the shela, in the aisle, and that makes it into a chiddush. And we don't derive conclusions from chiddush, and therefore we're going to go back to chatos, and we're going to derive the chumrah from chatos, that tam ki'ikar. But now we have a real problem, because if you recall, we started this sugya way back when to try to figure out how do we derive the din of bittul b'shishim, or alternatively bittul b'meya, and we had different calculations that were derived from Zroa ba'ayil, depending upon whether you calculate the bones or you don't calculate the bones, so you get to 60, you get to 100, all that should go down the tube. So you can't derive any conclusions from Zroa ba'ayil, because that's a chiddush. Ihochi lemea v'shishim nami lo ligmar. We shouldn't be able to derive 60 or 100 as far as the shear of bittul. And now the Gemara is going to introduce bittul barov. And this is the logic that we had yesterday, very compelling logic, that if not for Shishim and Mea, what would have been the alternative if the Torah hadn't set up our paradigm of bittul from Zroa ba'ayil? We would have come to the conclusion that it's batul barov. We're using Zroa ba'ayil lechumra to be mafkia, to undermine the halacha of rov. We're not going to allow for bittul b'rov, and instead we're going to require bittul b'shishim or b'meya. So that's okay. When you want to derive from a chidush, a chumra, that's legit. Now, at this point, Ravina, we go back to something that we learned on the previous daf, on daf Tzadi Ches, in which case we had a statement, a ruling of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, that we're going to derive from Ayil ben Nazir all the dinim of bittul. And the brisa that was quoted on the previous Amud seems to contradict that. And Ravina Amar Lo Nitzcho, we're going to reinterpret the brisa in such a way that it can be reconciled with Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, that Zroa ba'ayil becomes the prototype for all macholas asuros. Ela b'mokom chatach. All right, so this is a sugya that we learned some time ago. I think it was about, let's say, 10 blot ago or so, called Makom Chatach. Let's give one or two examples of Makom Chatach. Let's say, for example, you remember we had the case of the leg of the fetus that extended outside the mother's womb. The shechita was therefore matir any part of the fetus that was within the mother's womb, but not the foreleg that was extended outside the mother's womb. That was not included in the shechita. Now, what we have to do is take that foreleg, and let's assume, for argument's sake, it's asur midin eiver min achai, and now we have to cut it off so that we can allow eating the rest of the meat of the mother, which was shechted. but there's something called a mokom chatach, and that's the point in which you cut it off. And at that point, since there's contact between the foreleg, which is called the Aver HaMedudeles, and the fetus, the remainder of the fetus that's still within the mother's body, that has to be cut out as well. And that's the law in general, that we have to get rid of the makom chatach. We can't eat it. An organ of a live animal, okay, now we're talking about Aver Minachai, that was severed from the animal, but it's still dangling from the animal by a sliver. So we have to sever it together with the place where you cut it. So the outer surface of the meat that was connected to the Aver HaMedudeles is now aser. And Ravina is going to say that when the Brisa says that Ayel Nazir is a chidush, and we cannot derive any conclusions from Ayel Nazir as far as Dine Tarovas is concerned, that's only as far as Makom Chatach is concerned, meaning the Torah was Mekil in Zroa Be'ayel, and you just simply cut off the Zroa, sever it, and disconnect it from the aisle, and you can eat the aisle. You don't have to remove the Makom Chatach. Be Alma, as a general rule, when you have some part of the animal that's usur, like in the case of Aver Medudeles, then you have to prohibit the Makom Chatach for Hacha. But here, in the case of Zroa B'Shela, Zroa B'Ayel, we can be matir the Makom Chatach, so that even if the outer surface of the meat that bordered on the zroa should be cut off, and that would be the general rule that applies. When I say cut off, I should be really more careful about what I say. I don't mean cut it off and throw in the garbage. I mean cut it away from the non-Kohen and leave it for the Kohen. The Torah went ahead in the parsha of Zroa B'Ayel and was matir with a special kula. And that's what the Bryce had in mind when it said that Nazir is a chidush and cannot serve as a binyan av to derive that same conclusions about Mokum Chatach with regard to other isurim. So, for example, what we can derive from Ayel Nazir, and that's going to defend Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, is that with regard to the tam, meaning we're removing the zroa, but we have the tam of the zroa mixed in through the cooking process with the remainder of the ayel, that tam will be batel in shishim or in meh. Okay, now we're about to study a Mishnah in Orla. Okay, this Mishnah is called Kol HaMachametz Umetabel Umedamea Betruma Osir. So what's the subject of this Mishnah in Orla that we're about to learn? You have Chullin dough, but you CR is a chemical substance called leaven that you put into the dough, and that CR was truma. Or, for example, he uses a metabel, so that's called mechametz. Now, metabel means a spice, right? Tibulim are called spices. The spice is truma, and he spices chulin with spice of truma, or alternatively, he cooks truma together with chulin. Now, again, that doesn't make it into a chefetz d'isura, but it if the truma impacts its tam on the dough, on the chulin, then the dough cannot be eaten by a Yisrael. It could only be eaten by a Kohen. Yosef Rav Dimi Kamer Leila Shmaitita. So Rav Dimi was teaching that which we learned from Rav Asi. So let's go back for a moment. And Rav Asi was of the opinion that in the case of all tarovos, the shear of bittul, if Iser falls into heter and is cooked together in the same pot, is not shishim, but rather mea. And now, Rav Dimi, who's the star of our show today, although Rav is going to slug him up, but then Rav is going to defend Rav Dimi, and so forth and so on, Rav Dimi is going to ask a kasha and raise an objection against Rav Asi about mea, bittul b'mea, from a Mishnah in Orla. What does the Mishnah say? Vatnan, we learned in the Mishnah in Orla, the second parak, Lama amru kol hamachametz metabel metabel lahachmir. If the truma was a machametz, it was leaven, or the truma was a metabel, it was tavlinin, or the truma was midamea. Right? Midamea means that you blended them together and cooked them all in one pot. Truma with chulin is lahachmir. Now, the Mishnah has to tell us, what do you mean by lahachmir? You're telling me that because the truma in those particular scenarios fell into or was cooked with chulin, we have to be machmir, and we have to prohibit the mixture for a non-Kohen. It means because the truma gave a tam into the taroves because it was a machametz, or because it was a medamea. It was a machametz, or it was a metabel, and those are things that make a profound tam. Or medamea means it was less than the shear, which we'll see, of bittul. And the total mixture, therefore, is less than the shear of bittul for truma. Now, what is the shear of bittul for truma? Now, this is a little bit confusing, because up to this point, we had two possible shiurim of bittul in min b'sheno mino, and also in min b'mino according to Chacham of Rabbi Yehuda. And they are 60 or 100. Now we have a third possibility, which is truma, a unique halach in truma. And because the Torah is so machmir in truma, the Rabbanu were machmir in truma, and they require 101. So the Mishnah explains, what does it mean lahachmir? Min b'mino, if it's a case of min b'mino, that would mean a dough of truma that got mixed up with a dough of chulin, that's min b'mino, or lentils of truma with lentils of chulin, and beans of truma with beans of chulin, that all those cases which is called min b'mino. So therefore, we're going to be machmir and mekil. What does that mean? Lahakil ulahachmir. Now, when we say lahachmir, and you're talking about the same dough, let's say it's wheat dough of chulin with wheat dough of truma, that's min b'mino, then if there's no 101 in the chulin dough, the wheat dough, against the one of truma dough, that's called lahachmir, and that's the chumrah of truma, as we said before, that you need 101. But that leniency that allows you to be mavatel min b'mino in the case of truma with 101, that only applies in a case where the truma does not convey a tam. If it conveys a tam, then we have a kula of 101. If it doesn't convey a tam, then we're going to apply the principle of min bimino lo bata, that there's no bittul. Just one second. Maybe I got. So again, if we have the taste of the truma in the chulin, so if we have the taste of the truma in the chulin, because as we said, in the cases of machametz and mitabel, there's a profound taste. So then we can't rely on bittul. That's the chumrah. But on the other hand, if let's say there was no tam, then we could matir with mea v'echad. Min b'she'eno mino. See, I think we have to read the entire Mishnah in order to understand where min b'she'eno mino comes in, because if you stop here, it says ulahachmir, and then it says min b'she'eno mino. That's wrong. The words lahakil ulahachmir go back to min b'mino. So what's the status of min b'she'eno mino? Right, you have a wheat dough with a barley dough. Tani Seifa, that's the subject of the Seifa of the same Mishnah in Orla. Lahakil ulahachmir min b'sheinu mino. Even in the case of min b'sheinu mino, we have both lahakil ulahachmir. Ketzad. So let's see how the Mishnah works this out. Grisim shenisbashlu im hadoshim. So now we're talking about min b'sheinu mino, lentils and beans. Im yesh ba bahem b'nosein tam. So the truma gave a tam into the chulin. That's an automatic no-no, meaning once you have the tam of the truma, which is a chefta d'isura for a non-Kohen, then the tam prohibits the entire mixture. And bein sheyesh ba lahalos b'mea v'yechad bein she'ein ba lahalos b'mea also. Because again, there's an automatic oser. We don't need any other conditions if it's benosein tam. He says the Kohen tasted the mixture and determined that the beans. One second. Im yesh bahem benosein tam. Sorry. He says if a Kohen tasted the mixture and discerned the flavor of the truma in the mixture. So I guess this 101 is not absolute because it says here that yesh ben benosein tam ben yesh ben lalos b'mei v'echad ben ein ben lamalos also. So it's also because of the tam. Again, let's reiterate. The tam in the mixture is a no-no. It's an automatic absolute oser, irrelevant to what the ratio is. So even if the total mixture is 101 times the truma, the mixture is still forbidden. This is because a discernible flavor never becomes nullified. There's no bittul on tam if the tam is there. So that's the chumrah of min v'sheino min. Ein b'ayim b'nosein tam. Now we have the kula. So the Kohen tasted the mixture of the lentils and the beans, and he said there's no taste of the truma in the chulin. Is then bein yesh bein b'nosein bein ein bein b'nosein mutar. Here's the kula of min b'sheino mino. Because the whole purpose of bittul and min b'sheino mino is to get rid of the tam. The Kohen actually tasted it and he said there was no tam. So again, there's a lot of lumdus here, which we are not prepared to discuss, but let's see if we could just at least touch on the surface of it. When you have min bimino, then you don't have to apply the principle of tam ki'ikar. Why? Because when you look at the mixture, you can see the iser in the mixture. Again, you don't know which one it is, but whatever you're looking at, it's min bimino. The original iser is discernible, it's visible, and it's right there. So that's definitely the ikar ha-iser, and that can't become bottom. Again, according to Rabbi Yehuda, holds min b'mino eno bata. We have to see what the Chachamim would say. But in a case of min b'she'eno mino, we can't look and see where the Easter is. It's all mixed together. The min b'she'eno mino, the lentils and the beans, all of a sudden become mixed together, and it's not discernible. Therefore, you don't have the ikar, all you have is the tam. And if you have the tam, then the Easter will depend upon one or two things. Either you taste it and you either discern the taste of the Easter, you don't discern the taste of the Easter. If you don't, then it's mutter. Or alternatively, if you don't have anyone, let's say, for example, Easter beheter, then you rely on bittul, meaning either shishim mea. That's what we have over here. Now, the end of the Mishnah in Orla says, Ein bahem lahalos b'mea v'echad. So what do we have over here? We have min b'mino in a mixture, and there's no nesinas tam. The Kohen tasted it. And he says there's no tam of the lentils and the beans, the truma and the chullin, and therefore it's mutter, says the Mishnah, even though it doesn't have 101. Now the Gemara wants to analyze. What is the kula here? Is the kula here that automatically it's mutter and the non-Kohen can eat this mixture no matter what the ratio of truma to chulin is, because ein bahem, right? Because there's no discernible tam and the Kohen tasted, etc. Gemara says no. El b'mai, what the Mishnah is telling us, you don't require mea v'echad. The Mishnah is not saying that you don't require any shear of bittul. Now, when we go down from mea v'echad, what's the next number? Lav b'shishim. Right? We only know of bittul tam on two counts, either mea v'echad and truma, or in other isurim, shishim. And if we're saying here that because the Kohen tasted the mixture and there was no discernible tam, therefore we don't require mea v'echad. It doesn't say we don't require bittul. We don't require mea v'echad. Then the diuk is we should derive from that we require shishim. And that's going to be a problem. Why is that a problem? Because if you recall, we had a machlokes. What do we derive from zroa be'ayil? Is it shishim? Because we don't calculate the bones. Or as Rav Dimi said, it's mea. But here we're seeing that if there's no discernible tam, then the bittel's b'shishim. So how do you come off Rav Dimi saying that the bittul is b'mea? And here we turn to Amud Beis.